Back in the mid-90s, X-Men vs Street Fighter felt like pure magic, a chaotic fusion of two iconic worlds that until then seemed destined to remain separate. Let's be perfectly honest, the moment we first saw Ryu trading blows with Wolverine or Cyclops squaring off against Chun-Li, it was like witnessing the impossible made real. Not even in my wildest dreams could I have imagined a fighting game that was this cool, but here it was. This game surprised and amazed me, and back in 1996, it stood out so much that it felt like it shouldn't even exist. But what makes this game's existence even more fascinating is that even some folks at Capcom were reportedly shocked it got made, though not for the same reasons as me. Amusingly, their surprise wasn't about how cool the concept itself was, but rather the belief that if this game did see the light of day, it would flop, and then, in a best case scenario, fade into obscurity and protect Street Fighter's brand reputation in the process. That's right, some Capcom staff had absolutely no faith in this game. So today, join me as we explore how I know this, and just as importantly, why anyone could have reached what in hindsight seemed like such a ridiculous conclusion in the first place. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is why some believe that X-Men vs Street Fighter had no future. Yeah. X-Men vs Street Fighter. It's freaking amazing, isn't it? The vibrant sprite work, the booming announcer, the sheer absurdity of air combos that defied gravity. It all came together in a game that felt larger than life. And of course, who could forget the legendary tag mechanic? The game is simply divine, and swapping between fighters mid-battle set the stage for the entire Versus series to follow. Speaking of which, right now you can get all the classic 2D tag team fighters in one epic collection. Grab a massive 24% off of Marvel vs Capcom Fighting Collection using my affiliate link below. Or, if you're after something else, I've got huge discounts on Tekken 8, Street Fighter 6, its Year 2 Season Pass featuring Mai Shiranui, and thousands of other titles too, like the PC version of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth for example. Hope you'll find great deals that suit your taste. Happy shopping and enjoy the rest of this video. Due to the existence of the Marvel vs Capcom Fighting Collection we just mentioned, X-Men vs Street Fighter is now more relevant than it's been in years. After spending so long trapped on aging hardware and emulators, this legendary fighter is finally accessible to a modern audience, complete with rollback netcode for smooth online play. It's a golden opportunity for long-time fans to relive the chaos, and the newcomers to experience the game that laid the foundation for the entire Versus series. With a fresh spotlight on a classic game, this has led to some individuals who helped develop it come out of the woodwork and provide us with first-hand accounts regarding its original creation. One individual who took to X last year provided us with an account of what happened from their perspective. This man was Atsushi Tomita, a man who had an impressive career working at Capcom. Tomita's journey at Capcom began around 1994, where he cut his teeth as an assistant designer on the Marvel-licensed fighting games X-Men Children of the Atom and Marvel Superheroes. Under the guidance of Capcom legends like Akira Nishitani and Takeshi Tezuka, Tomita was thrown into the deep end of a bold new fighting game experiment, one that at the time wasn't exactly embraced within Capcom's walls. I'm of course referring to X-Men vs Street Fighter, a game that it seems that many higher-ups at the company were not too happy about even being made. In his first post reminiscing about this period, Tomita comments that neither X-Men Children of the Atom nor Marvel Superheroes were big hits in Japan, though they were big sellers overseas, which explains why I myself and many of you watching today will have fond memories of them. Due to the fact though that neither of these games grabbed much attention in Japan, Tomita adds that when some within the company learned that he would be making an X-Men vs Street Fighter game, that the attitude from some was that they hoped the game would just quietly disappear without anyone noticing, with a common belief being that by allowing their characters to feature alongside the American produced ones, this could tarnish the Street Fighter roster's reputation forever. Wow, talk about Japanese hubris. Imagine believing your work is so superior, so untouchable, that simply sharing the stage with another franchise could somehow taint its legacy. That was the ridiculous mindset of some at Capcom when they learned about X-Men vs Street Fighter. They weren't just skeptical, they actively hoped the game would fail, convinced that letting their pristine Street Fighter characters rub shoulders with the American-made superheroes would permanently stain the brand. As if Marvel's legendary roster, characters with decades of history, massive fan bases, and a level of cultural impact that dwarfs most game franchises were some kind of knockoff toys unworthy of standing next to Ryu and Chun-Li. Come to believe it, retrospectively it's quite embarrassing that some seem to think of it this way. However, in an ironic twist, this toxic attitude would end up doing the game a massive favour. Tomita adds that it was thanks to the criticism that the concept received internally that it was because of this extreme lack of faith that he would be allowed an extreme amount of creative freedom when making the game. After all, if you're a Capcom boss, why heavily scrutinise this one if you think it's going to fail anyway? Tomita believed the crossover game would find popularity because he felt that Japan's lukewarm reception to the previous Marvel games he had worked on wasn't down to their mechanics, nor was it due to a lack of quality, far from it. Instead, he believed the real issue was simply name recognition, and sticking Street Fighter characters side by side with the ones that were popular overseas could instantly change everything. But let's be clear, this wasn't just a lazy rebranding exercise. While much of the core gameplay of X-Men Children of the Atom remained intact, Tomita adds that it was supercharged with a brand new tag team system, a mechanic that would go on to define an entire subgenre of fighting games. It's also worth noting that perhaps due to the company's lack of faith, an extremely short development cycle was allotted to the crossover game. So, with development time short, Tomita made a bold decision. Instead of reinventing the wheel, he doubled down on spectacle. Every ounce of effort went into making the game feel fast, fluid, and outright explosive. Over-the-top super moves, screen-shaking taggings, and lightning-fast aerial combat turned every match into a high-energy spectacle. The goal was chaotic, satisfying gameplay, and it seems he and his team delivered in spades. Speaking of which, it seems that this quick turnaround time and focus on spectacle led to the game's glorious infinite combos being placed in the title as a beautiful accident, an unintended consequence of the game's breakneck speed, lenient combo system, and the sheer freedom it gave players. What made them so fun was how fluid and exhilarating they felt. The game's mechanics, particularly the air combos and super jumps, meant that players could juggle their opponents endlessly, stringing together move after move in ways that looked and felt utterly insane. Characters like Wolverine and Cyclops could launch an opponent, carrying them to the top of the screen, and keep them trapped in an aerial onslaught with perfectly timed inputs. Some fighters like Magneto and Storm could perform near unblockable sequences that looped endlessly. It was the Wild West of fighting games, where creativity and execution were rewarded with jaw-dropping, never-ending destruction. And here's the thing, players loved it. Even the competitive crowd didn't see these infinites as a flaw, they saw them as a skill test, a way to separate the casuals from the truly elite. There was something raw about it, something exhilarating about the fact that if you were good enough, you could completely dominate a match with nothing but perfect execution. It transformed the game from a standard fighter into an all-out war zone, where the biggest threat wasn't just losing, but being obliterated by a never-ending onslaught of hits. Tomita admits that due to time constraints, there wasn't even a possibility of balancing it like other fighters. X-Men vs Street Fighter was developed in a whirlwind, and by the time it hit location tests, those early arcade previews where players got a first taste of the action, the response was nothing short of electric. The hype was so intense that Capcom higher-ups weren't even waiting for the game to be finished before asking the team if they wanted to start on a sequel. That's how much faith they would quickly end up having in the project they had initially written off as ridiculous. The follow-up was meant to be Marvel Super Heroes 2, a direct sequel to Marvel Superheroes, keeping the focus squarely on Capcom's unique take on the Marvel universe. In fact, the project was even set to be helmed by a senior planner, someone with the experience to evolve a formula further. But then, as is so often the case in game development, chaos intervened. That senior planner was suddenly pulled away to work on Vampire Savior, the latest entry in the Darkstalker series at the time, and well, they never came back. With the planned Marvel Super Heroes 2 effectively dead in the water, Capcom pivoted. Rather than crafting another solo Marvel game, they doubled down on the crossover concept. Thus, Marvel Super Heroes vs Street Fighter was born, a game we have talked about plenty on this channel already. As for Tomita's recently released accounts of working on X-Men vs Street Fighter, he adds that at the time, Capcom's character designers had one thing on their mind: humans. They wanted to create fighters, not flashy visual effects, which meant that effects work was often seen as little more than a tedious afterthought. As a result, it got dumped onto the newest, least experienced team members, essentially a rite of passage for the juniors. But in a twist of fate, X-Men vs Street Fighter's team had a secret weapon: Sagata, the effects specialist. Unlike most, Sagata loved working on effects. While others saw it as busy work, he saw it as an art form, and crucially, he was damn good at it. Recognising this as an opportunity rather than a limitation, Tomita and his team made a bold decision. Rather than just treating effects as an afterthought, they leaned into them. They would weaponize visual spectacle, turning the game's effects into something that could set it apart from everything else in the arcade. And so they went all in. Every Street Fighter Alpha character was given brand new effects, bigger, flashier, more satisfying to look at ones. Super moves exploded with energy, special attacks left behind dazzling trails of power, and every impact felt like it mattered. This classic game popped when witnessed on arcade screens. As history now shows us, the gamble paid off. The game's effects weren't just good, they became part of its identity. The absurdly fast, high-flying gameplay demanded equally bombastic visuals. And thanks to Sagata's passion, X-Men vs Street Fighter was spectacular to watch. As for how these massive moves came to be, Tomita comments that it all started with a yoga fire, one that stretched all the way to the edge of the screen. When Sagata first showed it to Tomita, there was no grand design, no meticulous balance considerations, just ridiculous over-the-top spectacle that broke all the usual fighting game conventions. Tomita didn't know how to respond. How do you even balance something like that? But in the spirit of X-Men vs Street Fighter, where bigger was always better, he simply shrugged and said, "Okay, we'll figure it out later." And from there, the madness only escalated. Once the floodgates opened, there was no turning back. Plain unimpressive effects weren't just frowned upon, they were outright unacceptable. The team started critiquing and outdoing each other, constantly pushing the limits of how wild, flashy, and ridiculously cool every attack could look. If something wasn't eye-catching enough, it got scrapped or supercharged. That very philosophy led to the birth of one of the most iconic moves in fighting game history, the modern-day Shinku Hadouken. Originally, the team had created small individual projectiles for Ryu's Shinku Hadouken, tiny bullets meant to represent its powerful multi-hit nature. But with all the other characters getting over-the-top, screen-filling moves, these little Hadouken pellets suddenly felt underwhelming. The solution? Turn it into a beam. Not just a bigger projectile, but a massive, all-consuming wave of energy that looked like it could obliterate anything in its path. When designing X-Men vs Street Fighter, Capcom's team wasn't just focused on making the game look spectacular though. There were barriers to think about, most notably trying to work around hardware limitations. The Capcom System 2 arcade board was powerful for its time, but it wasn't limitless. Every bit of ROM space was precious, and by the time development was in full swing, they were already pushing the system to its absolute limit. Enter Apocalypse, the game's towering, screen-filling final boss. His sheer size wasn't just about making him look intimidating, though it certainly did. He was also a practical decision that up until now has never really been talked about. You see, what most people will not realise is that apparently creating a giant stationary boss actually saves space. Which probably has you wondering how. Well, basically, normal sized characters in the game require tons of animation frames for movement, attacks and reactions. But a massive enemy that barely moves? Nope, none of that is needed. Apocalypse took up far less memory, a clever workaround that meant they could relocate storage space to what really mattered, the game's over-the-top effects. So in a way, Apocalypse's overwhelming size wasn't just a power move, it was a technical hack that allowed Capcom to keep the rest of the game as visually explosive as possible. I already touched on the infinite combo happy accident in this video, but Tomita mentions that other, lesser known accidents play just as big a role in planning. Take the sparkling grain effect that appears when you super jump, a tiny but memorable detail that would go on to define the Versus series' signature aerial combat. Originally, this wasn't even meant to be in the game. It started as a simple hit effect designed by Sagata, but he scrapped it because it didn't feel like a strong enough impact. However, something in the programming glitched, and for reasons no one fully understood, the effect suddenly started triggering on super jumps instead. The result? It just felt right. Rather than fix it, they embraced the mistake, turning it into a deliberate feature. It was a happy accident that reinforced the game's already over-the-top movement, making every super jump feel weightless and dynamic, as if fighters were breaking through gravity itself. Tomita also points out that tag team switch mechanics in X-Men vs Street Fighter might have seemed like a revolutionary idea, but in reality tag mechanics weren't new. Wrestling games have been doing them for years, and even within fighting games, titles like Groove on Fight and Fun Tag Battle had experimented with similar concepts around the same time. But it was how you tagged in X-Men vs Street Fighter that set it apart. Instead of making the switch a slow, strategic action, Tomita and co. took things to the extreme. The tagging wasn't just a passive swap, it became an invincible attack move. No waiting, no vulnerability, just an instant high-impact entrance that led players to tag in their partner at any moment and immediately shift the momentum of a fight. The goal? Immediate gratification, the best kind. By making the mechanic flashy, aggressive and easy to perform, Capcom ensured that players could experience the fun right away, without needing to master complex setups. The result was a faster, more chaotic experience that defined the Versus series further, where tag mechanics weren't just a gimmick, but a fundamental part of the gameplay's relentless pace. And despite its technical limitations, the Capcom System 2 arcade board turned out to be the perfect canvas for this kind of spectacle. Compared to rival hardware at the time, the board was already feeling outdated, struggling to keep up with the competition's more advanced systems, but it had one secret weapon: its ability to display an absurd number of sprites on screen at once. This meant that, unlike in other fighting games where characters or effects would flicker or disappear if too much was happening at once, X-Men vs Street Fighter could handle everything: tag-in, special moves, multi-character chaos, all without a hitch. Players could execute massive screen-filling super moves, switching characters in midair, and pull off insanely fast combos, all without the game struggling to keep up. In the end, what could have been a technical disadvantage became one of the game's greatest strengths. The Capcom System 2 board's ability to handle sprite overload gave X-Men vs Street Fighter an edge over its competitors, reinforcing its signature high-speed, non-stop action. Tomita also states that when X-Men vs Street Fighter first started development, it was essentially just Marvel superheroes with a new roster. The game was running on the same engine, with no major changes planned, until the tag system was introduced midway through development. At first, this wasn't just grand design choice, it was a marketing decision, something to make the game stand out. But turning this idea into reality was a massive undertaking, one that fell onto the shoulders of Ikawa-san, the game's lead programmer. And what a task it was! A complete system overhaul took place, one that reshaped the entire game structure. Somehow Ikawa pulled it off, despite the ridiculous workload and countless late nights spent reworking the game's code from the ground up. His dedication was so extreme that Tomita felt obligated to stay up even later, pushing himself just to keep up with Ikawa's insane work ethic. Looking back, Tomita admits that in today's industry, a change this big, this late in development would be unthinkable. But that's what made X-Men vs Street Fighter what it was, a game that kept evolving no matter the obstacles. X-Men vs Street Fighter would end up being a game that embraced bold changes, even under pressure, proving that sometimes the best ideas come not from meticulous planning, but from quick thinking and sheer determination. The game that some at Capcom felt would tarnish the Street Fighter roster's reputation would actually end up further elevating their star power, demonstrating that the lineup could stand their ground against literal superheroes. Instead of fading into obscurity, X-Men vs Street Fighter did the exact opposite. It exploded in popularity, especially in Western arcades, proving that Tomita's gamble had paid off in spectacular fashion. The game's fast-paced, high-flying combat, combined with a now iconic tag system, resonated with players in a way that few fighting games had before. Rather than tarnishing Street Fighter, it injected new life into the franchise, helping pave the way for even more ambitious crossovers in the future. Ironically, the very thing that some within Capcom feared, the fusion of their beloved Street Fighter characters with Marvel's American superheroes, became one of the company's most celebrated innovations, forever cementing X-Men vs Street Fighter as a landmark in fighting game history, and for this reason, it deserves celebrating. And if all of this talk of X-Men vs Street Fighter has you itching to relive the golden age of tag team chaos, now's the perfect time, players. Holla holla holla. Right now you can grab all the classic 2D tag team fighters in one epic package. The Marvel vs Capcom Fighting Collection at a huge 24% off using my affiliate link below. Or if you're after something else, I've got massive discounts on Tekken 8, Street Fighter 6, its Year 2 Season Pass featuring Mai Shiranui, and even the PC version of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, plus thousands of other titles too. Hopefully you'll find something that catches your eye. Happy shopping and thanks for watching, and I'll see you all again soon. Cheerio!